So now that we have our clock face started, let's move up our graphic a little bit and start working on this area at the top. There's some kind of winder right here. I think this is sort of where you wind or set the watch, and then these are the two like start and stop buttons. And you've also got this little loop for holding this thing on a chain. So using this little magnifying glass, I'll zoom in maybe another step and then Command apostrophe to get my grid back. And now instead of the ellipse, let's use the rectangle tool. So for the rectangle tool, I think I'm going to be working at least initially in the same color I have down here. If I want to mimic that, I can hit I on my keyboard for eyedropper, not EYE, but I like the letter. And if I click on an existing graphic, it will mimic both its stroke and fill here in the color picker. So back to the rectangle, and then you can see this thing falls a little bit, it's a little unsure of where it's falling relative to my grid, so I may have to decide to either go larger or smaller. And for right now, I'm going to decide to go a little bit larger. You can see I'm overshooting here so that these graphics all clearly overlap, so I don't see any like corners poking out. And because this thing, it's all the same color, it's just going to blend in absolutely perfectly right there. Now for this little thing on the top, clearly it needs to be bigger than the vertical post, although if I go snapping to my grid, it's going to be considerably bigger. So why don't we try cheating here a little bit and just making this thing 3 grid lines across instead of 4. Now in order to get these two aligned, that's going to be a bit of a trick because the center of this box will not be able to land on a grid line and then still put itself in the center of the graphic. So to solve that, we'll use the Align tool. So click on the black arrow, make sure that our graphic we just made is selected, and then make sure that the object you want to align to is selected by holding Shift. So I've clicked on each of these objects while holding Shift, and now I want to align their vertical centers, but I don't want to move this item at the bottom at all. So to accomplish that, while these are both selected, I let go of Shift, and then I click one more time on the key object. Now that gets a fatter outline, and what that tells me is that when we align these things relative to one another, the key object will not move. Your screen might look a little different from mine, but here at the top, depending on your screen resolution, you should have some options for align. You may be able to see them all, or you may have to click like I did. And right here, we want to align our vertical lines moving through our pieces, although this, I guess they call it a horizontal align center. So I'll click that, and if you were watching, you could see the object on top scooted to the right, whereas the one below stayed in place. Okay, and then finally for this little piece to get it fleshed out, I'll go back to my ellipse command. I think I was trashing working with strokes before, but it's actually kind of necessary. Oops. So because these were selected, I changed their characteristics by mistake. So select an arrow, click on the background so nothing is selected, back to the ellipse tool, and then if I want, I can just hit this little swap arrow so that now that same gray is my stroke and my interior is transparent as opposed to the reverse from before. Okay, so as with before, I'm going to hold down on Option and Shift to grow from the center, and then we'll make a circle that's about yay big. Depending on how you're feeling, I might make something like that. I'm going to bump its stroke up to around 5, which not coincidentally is the same stroke as the arm of the clock face down here. And it's looking pretty good, although I think it's kind of weird how it just comes down and sort of touches the top of the clock face. I think it makes a lot more sense if it's about halfway up. But again, our grid snapping is preventing that. So one thing I could temporarily do is to go to Preferences, Guides, and Grid, and then make there to be twice as many subdivisions. So let's go to 16, and now that's going to give me the opportunity to pull this thing up effectively half of a grid unit, like that. So it's still massively larger than the one was before, so I may also try to shrink this thing a little bit. I'm holding down Shift and Option as I go. Maybe it makes sense to come down again because of that. Okay, so through a combination of fiddling around with the grid and so forth, I think in some cases if you work outside the grid, although in this case it was still 50% of the grid instead of some weird divisor. So sometimes you're switching around the grid to sort of help you try as hard as you can to stick to that standard grid size. And now that I've made my changes, I'm going to go back to the grid and switch this back up to 8. I don't think it'll be needed again, but we'll see. Z for zoom, hold down Option for negative zoom. And then I'm on a laptop, so I'm just using 2 fingers to kind of roll around. If you have a mouse, you can use the scroll wheel, and I believe hold down the right mouse button to get pan right here to move your image around like that. And then if I hide my background image and Command apostrophe the grid, I can see that this is starting to come together.